Good morning, evening, afternoon, or whenever you might be watching this. My name is Professor Ferrero, and welcome to U.S. History 1877 to the present. Now, in our last lecture, we ended off the 60s. We had talked about a lot of things. We had talked about the Cold War. We had talked about the Vietnam War, the Great Society, all of the different civil rights movements, including the African American Civil Rights Movement, the Chicano Movement, the American Indian Movement, all of those things. At the end of the 1960s, LBJ could have ran for another term. He could have finished up JFK's first term. There's about a little less than 2 years left, and he could have earned 2 more terms on top of that. However, because of the Vietnam War, he is going to tank in popularity, and he's ultimately going to decide to step aside. This is going to lead to the Republican who actually ran against JFK back in 1960 to win the election, Richard Nixon. We're going to be picking up with the Richard administration in today's lesson, the 70s, a decade of turmoil. The 1970s are going to be a time of a lot of political, economic instability. However, it doesn't start off that way. Nixon actually kind of starts off relatively strong in the 1960s. So, Richard Nixon. He's going to govern actually very similarly to LBJ before him. Even though he himself is a Republican, he governs very similarly to the Democrat before him. This is one of those interesting times in American history where there's a lot of political parity, a lot of political similarities between both the Democrats and the Republicans. He's going to create a bunch of government organizations himself. You might know some of these. The EPA is one of the really big ones that he creates, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is geared towards lowering emissions and overall just limiting pollution. And then another one that you may have heard of is OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. If you ever go to your job and you see posted in the break room those signs about safety, or those signs saying that you get a break after a certain amount of hours of work, that is OSHA. He also creates the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. So he's going to put in a lot of regulatory agencies to make sure Americans are more safe. Ultimately, he's going to be similar to Eisenhower in the regards to, he's actually going to decrease tensions in the Cold War. He helps things chill out. Things are getting kind of intense under Johnson, but he manages to bring them back down. He's also going to end the Vietnam War, and he is our first and only president so far to resign from office, which we are going to talk about when we get to the Watergate scandal. So, let's start going through this. To pick up on some ideas that we were covering in the last couple of lectures, you do start seeing even more expanded rights under Nixon for African Americans and women. African Americans are going to be offered welfare programs such as aid to families with dependent children. And by the 1980s, half of all welfare recipients are going to be black. They're also going to start pursuing affirmative action programs. It kind of started under LBJ. Nixon is going to pick up the ball and run with it. Affirmative action programs are programs that prioritize certain ethnic and racial groups over others. For most of its history, affirmative action tended to favor African Americans and Hispanics and tended to actually hurt whites, Asians, and Jews. For women, the sexual revolution is going to move into the mainstream. By 75, the amount of divorces is going to outnumber the time of first-time marriages. So for the first time in American history, more people are getting divorced in a year than they are getting married for the first time. You also see the creation of Title IX. For all of the college students watching, you should be very, very familiar with Title IX. Title IX is going to protect women in higher education in particular. It's going to give them equal opportunities to men in education, such as areas of academics and sports. Doesn't mean that women have to get all of the sports that men have, but for every male sport there needs to be a female sport. So men might have basketball, baseball, soccer, and football. Women need 4 sports as well. Maybe it's volleyball, softball, basketball, and soccer as well. So again, it doesn't mean they have to have every single sport the same. However, girls have to be given equal opportunities in athletics and in education in the schools. And ultimately, you're going to see an expansion of employment opportunities for women as well. So overall, just more protection for women, more opportunities for African Americans. And again, this goes to show that the 1970s does start off strong. However, it's going to end very weak. You can see the median age of a first marriage from 1947 to 1951. And if you really look around that 61 to 67 year mark, you see that the median age is really going to start ticking up at that point, especially for women, and even males after that when you get into the 1970s. So marriage has been on the decline in the United States since the late 60s, early 70s. You can also see that with the rates of divorce. In the 50s, you're really not getting over 400 births or divorces per 1,000 new marriages. By the time you get to the 70s, more people are getting divorced than they are getting married for the first time. So, détente. Yes, it is a French word. Détente means tense peace. It's the policy that Nixon is going to approach Russia and China with. Nixon is going to continue to handle governments deemed dangerous to America. Similar to his predecessors, he's going to be very aggressive to them, but he's also going to aim to relax the Cold War as a whole. He lowers tensions. So détente, easing of hostility, tense peace. Nixon is going to be the first ever president to visit communist China in 1972. This is also going to be the turning point where the U.S. stops acknowledging Taiwan as the real China and starts acknowledging mainland China as the real China. Since then, the U.S.'s at least legal policy, political policy, has been intentional ambiguity in terms of Taiwan, China, all of those things. Nixon is also later going to go to Moscow that very same year, and he's going to meet his equivalent. He's going to be the first ever president to visit the USSR. He's also going to sign the SALT Agreement, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which is going to limit the nuclear arsenals of both countries. Both countries say, hey, let's stop growing out our nuclear arsenals. Let's dial it back in. This is why, again, it's détente, it's tense peace. There's still that constant threat of war, but Nixon's going to help kind of defuse a lot of that. So détente, tense peace, SALT, you should know all of that. Here you have Nixon shaking hands with Chinese leader Mao Zedong in 1972, which is going to stun the world. It's a very similar response to what a lot of people felt whenever, I believe it was back in 2019, 2018, when Donald Trump was hanging out with Kim Jong-un. So it really just shocked the world to see a democratically elected leader, especially in a country like the United States, making peace with a communist dictator. So the end of the Vietnam War. Congress is pretty sick of what Johnson pulls with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They realized we gave the president way, way, way too much power over the military. So by 1971, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is going to be repealed, and that's going to limit the amount of power that Nixon has over the U.S. military. Nixon kind of realizes Johnson's strategy of gradual escalation is not working. You can think of gradual escalation as slowly turning up the heat, but the issue with slowly turning up the heat is if things are only a little harder today than they were yesterday, then you can continue to fight on. You can think of it as kind of slowly turning up the thermostat. It's not really going to be that bad as opposed to going from, say, like 70-degree weather to 100-degree weather. If you slowly raise the temperature, you're going to acclimate to it. You're going to get used to it. So Nixon says, away with that. Honestly, it was a pretty dumb policy. And he says, let's hit them as hard as we possibly can. We are going to basically punch them into submission. He's going to start using chemical weapons such as Agent Orange, which is a defoliant. Basically, it burns down forests. It had been used during World War II, although predominantly on uninhabited islands. Johnson did use it a bit as well, and he's going to start bombing Cambodia. You might ask, why the heck is he bombing Cambodia? Well, it's because North Vietnamese base camps were set up in Cambodia. Cambodia is adjacent. It's right next to South Vietnam. Perfect operation base for North Vietnamese fighting the South Vietnamese. Ultimately, Johnson's going to pursue an approach known as Vietnamization. Basically, He's going to run on getting the U.S. out of the Vietnam War. He's going to say the U.S. is going to train up, equip, arm to the teeth the South Vietnamese, and finally, whenever they are ready, we are going to leave and just kind of trust that they can support themselves on their own. So the U.S. is going to train them in military tactics. It's going to train their generals. It's going to give them weapons. However, once all is said and done, the U.S. is going to pull out of South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong run through the South, eventually taking over Saigon. It is one of the worst military blunders in U.S. history. Really, the only thing that probably maybe comes close to it, or maybe even surpasses it, is the U.S. pullout of Afghanistan. Now, you can make an argument for both Vietnam and Afghanistan. We should not have been involved in the first place. However, once we were involved, the people there that we were helping, that were helping us, became dependent on us. Ultimately, we left before they were ready to support themselves. The presidents at the time, Nixon, and for Afghanistan, Biden, both wanted to pull out very quickly for the symbolic victory of we're finally out of this war, and it resounded in huge disasters for both presidents. Ultimately, this is known as the fall of Saigon, Saigon being the capital of South Vietnam, and it's going to lead to a lot of South Vietnamese fleeing the country. There are many people, ironically enough, who fled China to Vietnam to flee communism in China, and then fled from Vietnam to the U.S. to flee communism once more. And the pictures are pretty horrifying, both in terms of what happens during the Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon. So again, you can see a little bit of a map right here. You can see Cambodia down in that bottom corner over there. You can see South Vietnam. You can see why Cambodia is such a big issue for South Vietnam. If the North Vietnamese are right there, they're able to attack far more easily. And you can see Saigon is pretty deep into South Vietnam. Here you see the napalming of Vietnam. Ultimately, it would leave hundreds of people chemically burned for life. These substances would stick to clothing and would often require the victims to strip. So you get napalm, you get Agent Orange on your clothes. It's going to chemically burn you. You need to strip it off. That's why you see this picture of this young child running naked in the streets. She was bombed with napalm. And this is the end of the Vietnam War. It is a horrific end. CIA operatives are helping evacuees flee Saigon as it's falling to the north and the Viet Cong. Literally, as this is happening, as this is the last helicopter taking off, the communist forces are running roughshod through the streets of Saigon. It is a massive, massive military blunder, and one that shouldn't be forgotten. If the pullout of Vietnam wasn't bad enough, Nixon is still very, very popular. He's going to win re-election. However, he's really going to bungle it in how he handles his re-election. This is all going to lead to the Watergate scandal. Nixon won a second term due to the Democrats splitting the vote. You have two different Democrats running on two different ideologies. It splits the base, and because of that, Nixon's basically going to have a free walk. It's very similar to the election of 1912. If you remember, Teddy Roosevelt and Taft split the vote, and Woodrow Wilson's able to walk into the presidency. So, during the previous election, Nixon aides, so these are like his secretaries, people who work under him, are going to break into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate building. It's the Watergate Hotel. They're going to bug it. They're going to put microphones throughout it. They're going to put spyware throughout it. Basically, Nixon's wanting intel on what the Democrats are going to be doing. Originally, when all of this comes to light, it actually can't be tied back to Nixon. These aides say that Nixon wasn't involved in it. He denies any involvement and knowing about it and knowing about the break-in. It just looks like some rogue Republican operatives. However, an informant is going to leak that Nixon had recordings of all of his secret conversations, including all of the secret conversations about Watergate. So whenever he sat down, he's having these conversations, he's going to record them. Eventually, Congress is going to ask Nixon, you need to give us the recordings. Nixon says, I'm not giving it to you. I have executive privilege. I, as president, I have immunity over these type of things. I don't have to give you anything. My Nixon impersonation right there. Congress goes to the Supreme Court. They say, hey, Supreme Court, does Nixon need to give us these tapes? Supreme Court goes, yeah, you do have to give them those tapes. Executive privilege, not really a thing, at least not in the way that you're defining it. Nixon says, all right, I'll give you the tapes. He gives over the tapes, and also he follows it up with, also, I resign. What the heck? Why did he just resign? Supreme Court rules he's not above the law. He has to hand over the tapes. He resigns. Why did he do that? Because he knows he's guilty. He knows if these tapes are played in Congress, he is going to be impeached. And once he is impeached, he's going to be removed. He is guilty. He's caught red-handed. He's caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Congress was moving to impeach Nixon, and he knows he's dead to rights. He knows he's damned if he stays in office. So he's going to go ahead and he's going to resign as president. You might think, wow, he's such a nasty president. He did all of these really bad and horrible things. Many other presidents have done similar things. FDR did similar things to his political opponents. The Obama administration is going to actively try to sabotage the Trump campaign back in 2016. However, the issue with the Nixon campaign is he got caught while he was in office. This type of stuff wasn't new, nor did it stop with Nixon. However, Nixon was just the guy who got caught doing it. And ultimately, if any president who was ever going to get impeached and removed, Nixon was going to be the guy who was going to be impeached and removed. So, this is going to lead to his VP, Gerald Ford, taking over. Fun fact about Gerald Ford, he's the only president in American history who nobody actually voted for. Reason being is because before Nixon stepped down, his original VP stepped down. Because of that, Nixon got to pick whoever he wanted to be his next VP. He picks Ford, and Ford is picked as his replacement. Ford is a fan of the Equal Rights Amendment. He tries to push that forward. It would have guaranteed equal rights in the Constitution, basically predominantly for women, but for also other minority groups. Ultimately, too, he is going to pardon Nixon as he believes it's best that the U.S. doesn't have a former president in prison. So he decides to excuse Nixon of his wrongdoings, not because he thinks Nixon is innocent. He knows Nixon is guilty, but he thinks it's best for the United States to not have former presidents in jail. While he didn't want the job, he is going to be convinced to run again in 1976. However, he's going to lose to Jimmy Carter for a multitude of reasons. He's lambasted by the media. He, I believe, has a trip and a fall at one point on Air Force One. A lot of people that think he's incompetent. I don't think a lot of that's very fair. And I think Ford, similar to JFK before him, he's really a president where we didn't get enough of him to see how good or bad of a president he would have been. He did some pretty great stuff. He did some not so great stuff. So, moving on to the next president, Jimmy Carter. I need to update this slide because he is no longer alive. He passed away recently. Ultimately, Jimmy Carter is a former peanut farmer. He's going to run as an outsider, and he's never held office before this. Ultimately, he was known for his negotiation tactics. However, sadly, he has one of the roughest presidencies in recent American history. He's going to pass the Camp David Accords. He tries to solve a lot of peace issues out in the Middle East. And ultimately, he's going to have a very, very rough economic go of it. All of that spending that happened in the 1960s, that's going to show up to bite Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. It's going to lead to stagflation. Stagflation is a combination of an economic recession, so that means the economy is down and unemployment is up, and inflation, which means the value of the currency is going down. That means the dollar isn't going as far as it used to. That is a horrible combination to deal with as a presidency. One or the other can be a death nail in one's presidency, but this makes it so much worse. Furthermore, conflict in the Middle East is going to lead to the rise of OPEC, which we will talk about in a couple of slides. Ultimately, he's a one-termer. He lives a shockingly long time. I do need to correct this. It says he was alive at the age of 99 as of April 2024. He passed away relatively recently. I believe it was at the end of 2024 at the age of 100 years old. And he's another one of those presidents where I think his legacy is really much better looking at him as a person than it is as a president. He's not really all that good of a president. However, he does a lot after being president, such as Habitat for Humanity's, building houses for the poor. He's a Sunday school teacher really up until his late 90s. He does a lot of really good stuff in terms of international diplomacy. So what is OPEC? I just mentioned that thing. What the heck does it mean? OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's going to be founded in 1973, and ultimately the U.S. in 1970, it's not founded in 73. In 73, the U.S. is importing 1/3 of all of its oil, and during the Carter administration, OPEC is going to be a group of Middle Eastern countries who get together and set oil prices together. Before this, they were all competing against each other. They were trying to offer the lowest price so they would have people buying their oil. However, all of these Middle Eastern countries are going to get together and say, hey, we're going to set the prices together. Basically, they're forming what would be similar to a trust. I know you guys know what a trust is because you paid attention back in Unit 5, right? So they are going to be angry at the U.S.'s involvement with a conflict out in the Middle East, particularly involving Israel and the Palestinians. They're angry about this. Because of this, they're going to put an oil embargo on the United States. They stop selling oil to the United States. So this is, again, due to support in the Arab-Israeli war. My bad. It's not with the Palestinians. I think it's actually with the Egyptians. Crude oil is going to double in price, and gas prices are going to spike drastically. Gas stations literally stop running out of fuel, and people start freaking out. So this is all going to go very, very poorly. You can see just how crazy these gas stations get with the oil shock of 1978. And literally gas stations start running out of gasoline. There are a lot of other issues for Carter. Again, we already mentioned stagflation. This is the end of that boom coming out of World War II. 30 years of growth and prosperity are going to come crashing down right on Carter. The U.S. was far too loose with its spending during the 60s and 70s. Carter's also going to have to deal with the Iran hostage crisis, and this is really going to be the nail in his coffin. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, I'm sorry if I'm saying that name wrong, I almost certainly am, is going to come to treatment for cancer in the United States. We had supported him being in charge of Iran. During this time, Iranian anti-American revolutionaries are going, who are predominantly college students, are going to take over the U.S. Embassy building in Iran. The U.S. Embassy building, every country has embassies in virtually every other country around the world. What is an embassy building? Say you go to China or to Japan, you lose your passport, or you need to get a hold of somebody in the United States, you can go to the U.S. Embassy building, and they basically function as a checkpoint, place of interest for foreign countries in a country. Say if you were Mexican and you lost your passport from Mexico, you would go to a Mexican embassy here in the United States and they would be able to help you. The U.S. is going to mount a rescue mission, however, with 2 military attack helicopters. However, both are going to malfunction, killing most, if not all, of the crew involved. This is known as Operation Eagle Claw. Some of the hostages are going to be released, but the last of them would not be freed for 444 days. This is going to look very, very bad on Jimmy Carter because he can't get these hostages free. So Carter administration is basically screwed at this point. They're out of luck. One positive thing that you can brag about Carter doing is he does pass the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. It's going to encourage banks to give loans to low-income communities. It does raise a lot of risk for banks, and realistically, it does feed into the housing crash of 2008. However, it is going to help a lot of people in the short term who can't find money to buy houses. And you can see just how bad the Iran hostage crisis is here. This is an American citizen being paraded through the streets of Iran by these Iranian revolutionary, really what they are is domestic terrorists, because they're going after civilians. The captors are going to be paraded around the cities as hostages. And again, this is what the Carter administration is going to end up ending on. It's going to end up, the 70s ends up as a decade of a lot of political instability out in the Middle East. We're getting involved. We pull out of Vietnam, and that ends up crashing down. On top of that, that post-war high that we had been riding since World War II comes crashing down as well. American civilians get kidnapped by an Iranian revolutionary group. All of that comes crashing down right on the shoulders of Jimmy Carter. And it kind of leads us to the question of, to what extent can we really judge anybody aside from the fact of their circumstances? Carter does what he can to try and solve these issues, but ultimately these issues are so big and outside of Carter, and yet he still gets blamed for them. Carter is remembered as one of our worst presidents in recent American history. Really leads us to ask, how will we be interpreted in the future? Will we be interpreted in the context of what's happening to us right now? Or will we be interpreted for our failures? If you have any questions, please be sure to go ahead and write them down if you're in one of my classes. If you're not, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below. If you're one of my students, please be sure to subscribe, or if you're not, and just go ahead and leave a like for the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out for me. As always, have an excellent rest of your day, and Ferrero out. Peace out, my dudes.